Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey Matthew, how's it going?
Hey Carl, doing okay.
Man, we're sliding home, man. This is it. We're gonna have one more episode. That's a culminating kind of thoughtful thinking back, but the discussions kind of led us up to here. So we've arrived, man.
This is it. This is gonna be a big one.
Yeah, and it is gonna be a big one. Warning to the listener up front. We've tried really hard to keep these under an hour, and we've been close. I think we've definitely done that. But this one, I feel like this is gonna shoot way past that.
Yeah, but this is not long. This is your Frampton Comes Alive.
Okay.
This is your double live album. You're like, just let it unfold. Let it just wash over you. You're no hurry, man. This is good stuff.
Oh, I love that. That's very good. Well, before we jump into the material, let's set the stage. Because, again, what we've been arguing or trying to say is that everything's leading, well, they didn't know it was leading to this, but this is kind of leading to where the center, we're going to talk about the resurrection as a historical event, which is, it's an outlandish statement. We'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
So let's set it up. So why don't you walk us through? Can you do that?
Yeah. So, so taking kind of two steps back and kind of, if somebody is just parachuting in on this as the first episode, I'll get you caught up here in the next couple minutes. So backing up to the previous podcast we did, Unmoored, we kind of discussed the fact that America's founders believed in a quote-unquote moral virtue foundation. It said, okay, this is essential for this self-government thing. And for them, Christianity was the key part of that foundation. Let's take that as a given. So Christianity's over here. Well, what's the foundation of that? Well, that's the Bible. All right. So if we're in a historical kind of slant, then let's examine the Bible itself. And hence that led us to this podcast series where we set out to look at the Bible solely as a historical document.
Yeah.
So, the questions that we ask of it is the questions we would ask of any historical document. Is it reliable? Is it accurate? Is it internally consistent? Not getting into the religious aspects of it. Just yet. We're just kind of looking at
and that's such a huge piece right there, is that we're not trying to say yay or nay, agree, disagree with any of the religious pieces, theological aspects that someone would maybe want to raise about something in the Bible.
Yeah.
So, yep, that's a good question. Maybe go find a priest, go find somebody to talk to.
Right.
That's not this talk.
Yeah, not this talk. Important, but not this talk. So we've been examining the Bible using the same criteria that would be applied to any ancient document. So early on, kind of getting the lay of the land, we talk about history itself. What is history? A historian. What is a historian? What does he or she do? What do they use? What kind of evidence? What kind of tools are at a historian's disposal? And, specifically delving into one of those things, not the only thing, is manuscripts, copies of manuscripts.
Yeah.
So using that as a starting point, we took a look at how this analysis that we talked about, how does that apply specifically to the Old and New Testaments? And what we kind of uncovered is, as far as the number of manuscripts, the reliability, the Bible really stands head and shoulders above any comparable ancient documents as far as the number of manuscripts, the reliability, and so forth. So our takeaway from that was that the Bible is the most historically secure work of antiquity. More evidence for Jesus perhaps than any other ancient figure.
Yeah, and that whole thing about antiquity, just again to remind the listener, certainly after the printing press, while you do still have some things hand copied, you basically can find the autograph.
Right.
And so you're able, and the autograph or the autographer, that's the original, And then, of course, by the time you get into, the 16 and 1700s, we have most of those. Like, we have an original copy of the Declaration of Independence, so that kind of a thing. So once you're at the printing press level, you have a lot less of the issues in late medieval and early modern history as compared to antiquity.
Yeah. So as we talked about throughout this whole thing, Bible being less a book in the traditional sense, more of a library of writing. So then the next logical question somebody should ask, well, why these writings and not other writings that existed around the same time? How did we arrive at knowing these were the ones that were reliable? So we took 2 episodes to explore the question of canon and what is canon, and discuss that process, and kind of delved into how it's not like that documentary, The Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
Not a documentary. It was not just a big committee where they're all squabbling back and forth and maybe like, we'll just make stuff up. Didn't actually go down that way. In fact, you posited for us that by the end of the 1st century, the Jewish canon was pretty much fixed.
Totally locked.
Widely recognized. It's locked down. So, okay, great. Old Testament, New Testament, we discussed how these writings were circulated pretty far out geographically, but how even the texts that different churches were using in cities far, far apart from each other, they were using the same text.
Same ones. Yeah.
So kind of fast forward to mid-2nd century, and pretty much all the New Testament books are already kind of pretty widely recognized. So contrary to what's sometimes considered to be the story, the councils that happened are less about voting up or down on different stuff, and it's more affirming the already accepted canon versus kind of creating it.
Yeah, that's good. Very good. So do you remember back in episode, I think it was 2, when we talked about the assassination of Julius Caesar?
Right, yes.
And we've all heard that it happened, but seriously, you could say, well, how do I know that happened? And of course, that's the question for all of antiquity. And simply because Shakespeare wrote a play and we all heard et tu, Brute, I mean, that kind of a thing. It's like, well, the only way we know is we have to examine the evidence. Well, so similarly, the examination of this proclaimed resurrection. And again, for the listener, just so you know on the outside, this is outstanding. This is hyperbolic. This is maybe even delusional suggestion that a human came back to life. And so when I say outstanding, I don't mean like good. I mean like, are you kidding me? You actually said that? You believe that out loud? You said that out loud. This person came back to life. So don't hear me approaching this as from a religious kind of story. So you have this outlandish, ridiculous story, but we've all heard it. Yep. I mean, there are a few people, I guess, maybe who haven't heard it, but Jesus is probably in the number 1 spot of like most known figure. Like, what do you know? And, again, resurrection kind of usually trickles in somebody. So we heard it. We heard he was killed. He was killed by the Romans. He's crucified. And then according to his boys and girls, this was resurrected. And again, we know that his team said it because non-Christian sources tell us that they said it. So we got this locked in early on. This is happening. But seriously, to quote myself again, how do we know this? Simply because some people like to believe in crazy stories or even fantasy? I mean, come on. Do people like Easter eggs? Is that the story? Chocolate bunnies? I mean, is that why we want to hang on to this? I mean, if you stop and think for a minute, the idea that there's a celebration about, both his birth and his death resurrection that still exists 2,000 years later, that itself is kind of like one of the weirdest anomalies in human history. We don't do that for anything else. I mean, we're going to celebrate the 250 birthday for America, so we have some fireworks and stuff, and there's maybe a few other things that certain countries remember really important in their history, but I'm just scratching my head to think of something even 500 years ago that happened that everybody's like, woohoo, celebration day.
Yeah.
Like, we don't do that. And then to think that a ton of people who don't even believe in Jesus join in, that's a whole different, that's a sidetrack. But anyway, so what do? We have to discern. With all events, we have to look at the history based on the evidence. Without the evidence, it's all hearsay. It's all just your 2 cents. But then once we have the evidence, then even if we find something that's hard to believe, you're confronted with the evidence. So go back to the assassination, right? We have solid evidence that there was a dude named Caesar and he was killed. We have a couple of eyewitness accounts from Cicero and Sallust. We have some histories by Suetonius, even some later, meaning 150 years later, histories written by Discassius and Appian. We have Suetonius' work is more biographical, but Plutarch also writes. So we've got this really good, solid history, and we have some archaeological evidence that helps us corroborate the written evidence. So we're like, okay, seems like there's no reason to doubt it. But remember, when we had that conversation, go back to episode 2 and listen, we found that there are textual discrepancies. We found weak manuscript evidence, and we even found contradictions. You might say slight contradictions, but again, you have contradictions that if one wanted to, they could say, well, then maybe that didn't happen. And we're saying it happened. No historian would say that didn't happen because the evidence is either weak or not enough, or there's some contradictions. I know there's a difference between saying historians debate what it meant. That's not what we're saying.
Right.
So again, we're not going to debate what the resurrection means really in this conversation, but we're just going to say whether it happened or not. And I mentioned last time we were talking about, as we close the episode out, another historical event, one of my favorite ones, is when the Carthaginian general Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and the Alps with war elephants in his army. And I said, having grown up in the mountains, I can say I believe it's impossible for elephants to climb up the mountains. And yet, I'm confronted with solid historical evidence, like it or not. Well, similarly, Carl, I'm not speaking for Matthew, Carl, believe humans do not come back to life. They die, but I mean, I know there's near-death stuff. I'm not saying that, but I mean somebody dead 3 days in a grave, stinky body, all that kind of stuff. That doesn't happen. But I also have to say, I need to examine the historical evidence because, like I just said, we've got this event 2,000 years later, and some people don't do it for the Easter eggs. Some people do it because they actually still, this day, early for 21st century, they believe it. So it's like, okay, well, are they just crazy? Let's kind of dig into it. And so we've done all that. And as you just said, we've got really strong evidential support historically for the evidence in this library about this event. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dig in and say, okay, let's examine this event that we're told about and use all the kind of historical tools to see if we can come to a conclusion.
I like it.
All right. So now, just to make sure if people who are not Christians, like, why do I need to necessarily know the resurrection? That's because, remember, we're looking, as Matthew said earlier, the founders believed this was the core source of their moral virtue foundation. So then, the Christian faith is what? Well, you can say it's a lot of things, but historically, regardless of what you may know of rituals and different teams called denominations and different strategies and things, put all that aside, what the Christian faith, by its own evidence, is about this fact. This guy claimed he was God and then was killed, and then 3 days later, according to his team, comes back to life. The resurrection is at the center of this faith. You can't have this faith and not believe this thing.
And that's what it says itself.
Exactly. Right. And an example of that, you can see it in 1 Corinthians 15. So Corinthians is a letter that our boy Paul, we've mentioned before, writes to the city at Corinth. You can also see this if you just read the 4 Gospels. Remember, those are kind of like the bios of Jesus. Every one of them have different things that they tell. There's only a few places where they tell the same thing, but all 4 of them have a prolonged section in the back, or the second half of their writings, that are all aimed at telling their understanding or their version of this event. Now, it's called collectively the Passion. It's all about getting into the Latin, and we're not going to go down that road. But just so you understand, there's this thing about the last days of Jesus, him rolling into Jerusalem, getting in final trouble with the authorities, killed, resurrected. And one of my professors in seminary, he described it. He said, when you can read this, it's kind of like you're reading just a long prologue before you get to like the first part. So like for Mark, who was the first of these Gospels, chapters 1 to 10 is this prologue. And then the whole story about the end, the Passion, chapters 11 to 16. With Luke, it's even more. He basically goes from chapter 1 and 2 are kind of like Jesus's backstory. So really chapters 3 to 10, so 7 chapters, are about like all the stuff he did. And then in chapter 9, Luke says, as the time drew near for him, Jesus, to ascend to heaven, ascend meaning in his resurrected alive form. So from 951 through 1927, those are chapters and verses, you know, your Bible, he's describing stuff all the way in, and then from chapter 1928 through chapter 24, it's all about the passion. So from chapter 9 through chapter 24, I can do the math fast, something like 15 or 16 chapters of information. He's talking about this kind of final moment. And when you read the letter that Paul wrote, he says this, he goes, a couple key phrases, and you can read it yourself if you can get a Bible. So again, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 12. But he says in verse 14, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, as so is your faith. I mean, you're claiming a faith, but it's useless faith. And then later he repeats himself. He says, and if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you're still kind of lost or separated. He says, still in your sins, but the idea, remember I've talked about the maker. So nothing's been solved. You're still kind of trapped. And then this is the key verse. He says that if the resurrection hasn't happened, we are of all people most to be pitied. And I've always loved that verse because it really gets into it. Because, you know, if you find out, oh, Carl believes in the resurrection, I think there's a part of me that agrees with you if you go, poor Carl, or as they would say in the South, bless his heart.
Bless his heart, pat, pat, pat.
Yeah, you're just a stupid loser for having believed this craziness. Why would you believe this craziness? It was like when I had back when I was single, had a couple of girls that I thought who were beautiful, who maybe they'd go out with me, and my friends were like, bless your heart. That's not happening, dude. Just not going to happen, right? So to be pitied, right? You'd be pitied for following along in this kind of delusion. And Paul is writing, and remember we'll see later, Paul's already claiming he's seen Jesus. So there's nothing you can find about Christianity from the earliest Christians that says the resurrection is non-essential. Okay, so we're good there.
Yeah.
Central. Well, here's the easy part. Jesus was killed by the Roman method of capital execution called crucifixion. Now, we don't need to spend a lot of time here. You might think we should spend a lot of time here, dear listener, but it's kind of secondary. The reason it's secondary is because nobody doubts this happened. So every source we can get our hands on, Christian or non-Christian, are confirmed in this process. The consensus is he was killed this way, and there's no doubts about this. So everybody's good on this page. But just in case, because it may come up later, that you may say to yourself, well, what exactly does that mean that he was crucified? Just want to point a couple of things out, right? So the Romans were really good at this. Now, a lot of people were really good at doing mass executions. By the way, the Romans didn't make this up. We're pretty sure they got this from Persia. But the Romans perfected it.
Yeah.
And they became really good at it.
Yes.
And so there was beatings and whippings before the whole thing started. Many victims died even before they got to crucifixion, although that was never the plan. If that happened, the Romans in charge were like, shoot, we messed up. The point was to beat them to near death, but to leave them alive enough to feel the pain of what happens on the cross. But some of them died from, I'm going to get this is a big fancy medical word, hypovolemic shock, which is where the heart tries to pump blood that isn't there. Why isn't the blood there? Because it's now rolling down your back and it's gone from your body and you've lost a couple of liters. So then that happens and there's a whole bunch of things that go down, right? So, but the Romans were really good at doing that kind of beating, and they would get so far where they could basically, with the whips that they used or the sticks that they would use, they could lay bare your skin, you've all skinned your knees, right? You know what that's like. Your skin's still there, but now you don't want to touch it because it hurts really bad. You put a Band-Aid on it. It's like the upper layer's been removed off.
Flayed, yeah.
You can do that even further down. God forbid you have to do that. That's why when I ride my motorcycle, I always gear up. I always wear long pants, boots, jacket, glove, because I see people riding with pants, shorts. I'm like, dude, are you, man, okay, whatever. So then they're stretched out on a piece of wood. This has been debated by some historians, but the evidence, again, including archaeological evidence, is pretty secure on this. In not all cases, but in most cases, the Romans would use a nail to nail through the wrist and the feet, particularly the wrist. That was for sure, the wrist was the biggie. And part of that was, as they would do that, they would hit the median nerve, right? And so this is where we get, the term excruciating.
Mm-hmm.
It means out of the cross.
Excruciating. Yeah.
So some of you may say, I've had excruciating pain. Any women listening who have had babies might say, I've had but particularly if you didn't go down the road with having the drugs that they used, natural childbirth kind of thing. Excruciating, meaning the pain is so intense. And so that word comes to us meaning as a reflection to the pain experienced by people on crucifixion.
Wow.
To stretch them out, typically they did it intentionally in a way that dislocates the shoulders. It wasn't like just, oops, it was like they stretched, and sometimes they put their knee kind of on the rib cage or the hips and then yanked the arm because they wanted the arms overstretched. And that was so when they got up on the cross, standing kind of a thing, it meant you couldn't hold yourself up. I mean, it's hard enough if you stretched your arms out. Most of us, after about maybe 30 seconds, we're lowering our arms. So imagine they were held there. You can imagine the discomfort you'll feel in your shoulders. But now, to make it even harder, you've kind of extended it. And then, of course, you're in a position where you're having to come up to breathe. There's a whole bunch more I could tell you, which is really kind of gross and uncomfortable about kind of what happens and how a person has to breathe. Death came most often through asphyxiation, though sometimes heart failure could occur. But it should be noted, in general, most crucifixion victims lasted somewhere between a day and a half to 3 days on the cross alive. So this is after you've been beaten near to death. You've had blood loss, but still, it wasn't like, if you've heard of, like, say, drawn and quartered, I mean, that is a horrible way to die. And they also inflicted that. This is the Middle Ages type thing. They inflicted that in a way that would bring you the most pain. But you're going to die.
It's going to be pretty relatively quick.
You're going to have maybe 20 minutes of pain, maybe 40 minutes and it's going to be horrible. But then you're going to pass out, and then they're going to cut your head off.
Yeah.
And it's over. The crucifixion concept was to cause you an immense amount of pain that lasted prolonged periods of time.
They were scientists at this.
They were very good at it.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can read reports where both Christian and non-Christian medical doctors have talked about this, and their takeaway is that there's no way someone could get off the cross alive. It's not happening.
It's not happening.
And because sometimes victims would last a long time on the cross, the Roman soldiers, if they got bored or they needed to move on or there was something else going on, they didn't do this all the time. But they would sometimes break the legs, break the kneecaps, so that the person no longer could use their lower extremities to push up to breathe, so kind of hastened the death process. All right, so there's just no debate about that. Jesus was killed. Everybody's clear. There was a dude named Jesus, and he was killed. And just like there's no debate about how Caesar was killed, he was stabbed to death. Now, there is debate, as we talked about in episode 2, about, well, what instrument was used, because there's daggers and there's swords, right? So the challenge then isn't about the cross. The cross and the crucifixion is one of the most, I would say, the most highly attested events in history. But then the challenge is, what do we do with the empty tomb? And the fact that the followers made this audacious, ridiculous claim that he was alive. So this is where we are now. Someone could say, well, you know what? I don't care. I don't really care. And of course, you're probably not listening to the episode at this point, but if you were listening to the episode, and you say, well, I don't really care. I don't need to care. It's not important to me. As I tell my students when we're doing this in my Western Civ class, it's like, you may not like religion. You may specifically not like Christianity, which is fine. But we can't not talk about it because of its continued existence for 2,000 years and its deep impact. Now, if you go back to Unmoored, I think it was episode 5 and 6, but one of those 4, 5, and 6 areas where we talked a lot about the impact Christianity has had. So whether you like it or not, that impact has remained, so we're stuck with it. I mean, by about 150 AD, all across the empire, you had many non-Jewish people believing this story. So we're talking about less than 100 years, or right around 100 years, that this man rose up from the dead. And then by 300, so another 150 years later, and we talked about this in the episode where we looked at Constantine back in last season in Unmoored, that the faith had expanded throughout the empire, as far as the British Isles, as far as the Iberian Peninsula, probably somewhere around 25, maybe 30% of all the citizens. All right? So for the rest of the episode, we're going to talk about then what is the historical evidence about this. All right? So that's kind of where we're going to go. Right? Any questions so far?
No.
Okay, so we got this. We got the story. Here's the first piece of evidence. We have multiple creeds that are quoted in some of the writings of the New Testament, right? So remember we talked about this in a couple other moments, but there's several places. Here's a few of them. So Romans chapter 1, Philippians chapter 2, those are both letters that Paul wrote. Peter quotes one in his first letter, 1 Peter 3:18. There's another one in Thessalonians. Some of these we think may have been songs, like singing songs, kind of a thing. And remember now, with the creed, it's important to remember that the creed is a quoted thing that comes before the formation. Now, I'm not saying that well. Let me say it again. So we have a Pledge of Allegiance, right? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States, to the republic for which stand, right? The ideas that the creed reflects exist before the words.
Yes.
Right? So whether you think of United States of America or republic, or it says one nation, so the idea of a nation, indivisible, these are ideas that are then later expressed in a creed. And our pledge is a good example of that. It didn't even, the first version of it was composed in 1892. So, 120 something years after the country had existed. So the creed is reflecting something already understood.
Yeah.
So when you see these ideas of these creeds, you're able to say, okay, so when Paul's quoting it, it's existed before he quotes it. We talked about this in a couple other non-Christian documents. But then if you say, well, wait, the creed is a quotable thing, but the ideas existed before the creed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they not only existed, they existed long enough for there to be kind of, yes, we all agree to this. In fact, let's create a phrase that kind of is a snapshot of what we say we all believe. Well, that doesn't happen in a month, Yeah. A certain amount of time it has to exist prior to the creed.
So the creeds give us clarity that these various Christians believed in a living Jesus who had been killed. So that's that radical. So the most famous one is back to the same letter to Corinth that Paul writes. So why don't you read this for us? This is in chapter 14.
All right. I passed on to you what was most important and what had also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the Scripture said. He was buried, and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Scripture said. He was seen by Peter and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he was seen by James and later by all the apostles.
And actually, a little bit after that, he says, and then, lastly, seen by me, kind of a thing. And just, everybody, first of all, when it says just as the Scripture said, he's talking about the Jewish Old Testament writings. So Christ died for our sins. He's saying that's stated in the Old Testament. And when he says that raised, just as Scripture said, again, he's kind of going there. All right. So besides that, what are some of the facts that you can see laid out here in this creed?
So he's saying he's seen Jesus. He knows people who have also seen him, but he's talking to people who would not have. So he's kind of laying out the case. He goes, you might have a question about this. Understood. Here's my credentials. Here's my bona fides.
Yeah.
It's like, and specifically, these people are still alive.
Meaning,
you want to check it out? Check it out.
Go talk to them.
It's not like it happened 500 years ago and, there's no room for verification. He's like, bro, shake it down all you want. This really, really happened.
And this idea, because I've always thought about this, he was seen by more than 500, most of whom are still alive. He doesn't name them, obviously, right? But that would have to imply, because of the way he's saying it, you guys in Corinth, which is in Greece, some of the names of these people, meaning it's not like just Paul's out there in this case, with Barnabas, or he's wandering around with Titus, or Peter's there's like 5 or 6 guys who are going around telling the story.
By contrast, other non-Christian religious figures, I had this vision and this thing appeared and, oh, cool. Well, who was around? It's me. Well, okay.
Yeah, I'll maybe take your word for it.
Maybe take your word for it. But put that on the scale.
Comparatively.
With this and Jesus.
Yeah.
And you take it from there. But
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, one of the things you'll hear me say a couple of times here is that he names names.
Yeah.
And for you and me, obviously, it's 2,000 years later, so like big deal. But you have to read it in the time of getting the letter. He's saying to these people, like you just said, you don't believe me, go ask these guys. See if I made this part up. Now, somebody could say, well, how do you know that's a creed? Like the version that I have, like I put quote marks starting with Christ died for our sins, and then later by all the apostles, unquote. And the next part, if you kept reading in verse 8, is where he does say, and lastly by me. Because he's not quoting that, he's kind of throwing himself in there. The creed stops there with by the apostles. Well, first of all, some of this is tough to see if you can't see it in the original language. So feel free to go look in the original language. But for instance, at the beginning when he says, I passed on or I delivered to you what had been given or received, he's using technical words there in the Greek that are not the normal vocabulary that he uses. And it's like he's being very specific in a narrow disciplinarian kind of way for quoting something. He's kind of saying this is the words that would be used by Greek speakers to talk about the transmission of a specific core instructions, or beliefs. So like me, classes are starting this next week, right? So if I went over the syllabus in class and then a month later, I would say some version of, remember when we read through the syllabus, or I've given to you the syllabus instructions, right? That's how we would say in English. He's saying something very specific here and kind of quoting. And so that's a signal to the reader, this is not Paul's thought. This is Paul's agreement with something else. And he's saying, I received it.
It's a copy paste.
Yeah, it is a copy paste. Well, when did he get it? Well, we know the letter was written around 55 AD. We know he first visited Corinth in 51. We know that he said he had the creed prior to that, because he said, I passed on to you, I delivered to you what I had received, right? So then he had to have had it before 51. Okay, so when did he get it? Meaning he was given this. Well, what possible way could he have been given this? Well, there's a lot to Paul's life that we know chronologically. I'm not going to give you the whole beat down because it's a lot of details, but we know roughly, and we've said this before, he was converted around 32 AD, maybe 33. And then somewhere in about a 3-year window after that, he had a meeting with the core apostles who were in Jerusalem. And he describes it in one of his letters to the churches in Galatia. And he says that he, Peter, and James had an examination. Now, again, they examined him. Because remember, and you said this, I think, in one of our episodes, right? Telling us about Paul's life. He was a bad guy. He's running around killing people.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden he's like, no, I'm with you. And so Peter's like, I don't believe that at all. And so enough people had said, no, it's legit. He's actually preaching for Jesus now. He's bringing in converts. Like, I want to have a conversation with this dude. And so they basically had him come to Jerusalem for a test, like a final oral exam, like a master's or doctorate student has to go through. All right, dude, you're going to have a conversation. And again, there he uses a very specific word that it's a technical word, saying that he had an interview or a visit that was an examination of himself kind of thing. And so then when you go through that, you can say, okay, so probably around 35 AD, which for you and me means in at least 5 years of the event of Jesus' death and supposed resurrection, they've already come to an agreement. So this is really early evidence. This is not like in 550, there's a creed that said this guy, Jesus, came to life. And then there's other writings that sort of maybe kind of connect to it, that people in 500 or 550 can say, wait, well, this verse said this and it sort of means that. We're talking 5 years. There's no way, there's no mythology that builds at that point. These are people who are saying, we're on the record. As you said, it names names. He makes clear assertions about when the event happened. So this is really important kind of narrowing down that there is very early evidence that these guys are making the claim. And like I told you, we also have some non-Christian evidence, which is also in itself very early, say within 50 to 60 years, in which it's saying these guys believe that this thing happened. All right, we good?
Yeah.
Okay, so second piece is really jumping off that there are specific witnesses named. It'd be one thing if the creed had said something like, I passed on to you what I heard from you, that Jesus came back to life and a bunch of folks saw him. The end. And you and I could say, well, he said there's a bunch of folks. But as we've already alluded to, he's specific. Like, these are people you can talk to. And again, we get the idea that James and Peter are named, and then he specifically uses the phrase the 12. Everybody knows the 12 meant the core apostles, which is the original 11, not Judas, and the next guy that they brought in. It's all told in Luke's history of the thing, a guy named Matthias. So the 12 was like an official designation. So, you got Peter, who's one of the 12. So you got 12 people. James makes 13, and then another 500. And it's with the 500 that he says the part about them being alive. Okay. All right. So that list of people is there's actually more people who we know saw Jesus than that list, right? So if you go through all the historical evidence, you see different types of people who are mentioned, starting with Mary Magdalene. She's really the first one. You've got a meeting that Jesus has with 10 of the disciples. If you know the name Thomas, we'll come back to him later. He wasn't there. Then we're told of another meeting that involves Thomas. We're told of 2 disciples that are walking to a city called Emmaus, and Jesus appears to them. One of them is named Cleopas. It's possible that he was walking with his wife because in John tells the story of the crucifixion. He mentions that there was a woman with the crucifixion whose name was Mary, the wife of Clopas. And some scholars believe that Luke saying Cleopas, which is Cleopas, is actually somewhere there's a misspelling between that and this person in John where it's Clopas.
Interesting.
So maybe it's a husband and wife walking out. They're sad. In other words, doesn't matter. Jesus comes. There's another Mary who's talked about being at the resurrection moment. And so so you've got this long list. And again, it should be noted in almost all of these cases, it's 2 people or more. Now, 1 or 2, there is just, so Paul, Paul's got some people with him, but they don't claim to see Jesus. They hear stuff, but they don't see Jesus. And then depending on which one of the Gospels, Mary Magdalene may have been alone or had at least one interaction with Jesus by herself. But in most of them, there's more than one, which is important because like you said earlier, even if you're not thinking about religious figures, if I say, I had a vision, Matthew, you're like, okay, Carl, I kind of believe you. Sure. But it'd be different if it was me and 3 of my friends that you happen to know, and all of us are saying we saw the same thing. And also, this is kind of getting into the question or helping build the defense if someone says, well, wait a minute, this could just be something that you're making in your mind. So these are not dreamlike. None of these are at night, or they're not considered to be like in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. when someone could be dreamy or woken from a deep sleep, and we might think, maybe just mistaken something, right? These are all reported as up close, or at least most of them are up close. There's talks of hugging. There's talks of touching. There's talks of Jesus saying, don't touch me. There's talks of eating. There's talks of watching him eat. There's talks of walking. Right, so these are not just, I had a vision, it was kind of like a dreamy, I mean, if you want to pick on Paul for a minute, the way he describes his, if that was the only description, I don't know that I'd be a Christian. Because it does sort of sound like you see in a movie where there's like glowy light and it's kind of floating in the air and there's these separate words and the people with you, they don't see anything. So you have this little vision, right? If that was the only thing we had, I might be a skeptic of the process. But when you look at all these stories collectively, you start going, okay, ooh, that's a lot of good evidence. And again, Carl's on the side, I don't know where Matthew is, but Carl's on the side of, look, humans don't come back to life. So I'm the skeptic here. You got to convince me of this thing. And now I'm getting some stuff that's hard to confront, hard to dispute. Like what you say you ate with him, and then you say you ate with him, and then you say you walked with him, and then you saw you hugged him. I mean, you got a lot of different people in different moments having these physical, it's daytime, there's groups.
Yeah, and Paul's writing it with the understanding, behind his words, I'm hearing him say, I know you're not going to believe this. So let me lay out the case, which I think is great. He's like, obviously, if I say it, you're gonna take it at face value. You're like, why would somebody take something at face value? So we're all on the same page, whether you believe it or not, that this is a fantastical thing to happen.
Yeah, and Paul's testimonies, these are trials. So they don't do the same sort of, swear on the Bible kind of things like we do, but the witness is under oath, basically, we would say. And what's interesting is if you read his testimonials there, as well as some of his written biography moments, because there's a couple places where he describes it, identical. So he's not off script. He's not making and kind of going different directions. And you can put that, so this is really our next piece of information here, is that you can put that as an early testimonial source. And when you look at the other ones that we have, so like we have very early, like within days, basically, about 40-something days of Jesus being resurrected, Peter gives a big sermon. And so you've got him also under trial some months later in front of like the Jewish high council. There's moments we have of Peter giving a testimony in front of a Roman official who's interested in Christianity but still is giving a testimonial. Mm-hmm. All of these testimonials are historically early, meaning the evidence for them is not, well, somebody wrote that in the year 625 and just post-dated it. No. This is like, we have very good evidence, which goes back to the early episodes we talked about, that we're saying there. And when you read both Peter's sermon and Paul's testimonial, back to kind of what you said with the creed, in both cases, you've got them saying, look, dudes, y'all were here. This ain't done in a secret. This happened among you. Peter is really specific when he says that this is comparatively to our national hero David, because he says David, he died, was buried, and his tomb is right here. We know where it is. And there's an empty tomb where we all know Jesus was laid. And like, it wasn't like Jesus was laid in secret. He was over in this tomb. Y'all knew where the tomb was. And what's really funny, I love this one too, is so Paul later gets arrested. We talked about this. He gets taken to Rome, and it's a big showdown. Well, before he gets taken to Rome, he's held for 2 years in prison in basically the Middle East, in Palestine. And so the governor who put him in prison gets replaced. So a new governor comes and, hey, governor, we're glad you're here in a new role, a bunch of stuff you got to do. Oh, by the way, one of your many prisoners is this dude, and he said a bunch of stuff. And so you can read Dr. Luke's account of the testimony that he had in front of this guy. This guy's name is Festus. I know, don't make fun of the name. But at the same time, we're told by Dr. Luke, Festus is kind of ready to hear this report. And it's in Festus's report that Paul's like, take me to Rome. And as a Roman citizen, he has that right to claim, I need to go in front of Caesar. I want to go to the Supreme Court, basically. Mm-hmm. Festus is like, groovy, dude, I got you. We'll put you on the next boat out. But before that can happen, the then kind of Jewish leader for the land, a man named Herod Agrippa II, he shows up really basically to meet the new governor, kind of shake hands and, hey, here's who I am. And he's like, dude, you're Jewish. Why don't you listen to this guy's story? And so we have yet another testimonial moment in the writings there in Dr. Luke's account in the Acts of the Apostles. And in this, he says, okay, tell us your story. So after examining all the information and explaining, this is Paul doing the explaining, that Jesus had come back to life, in his opinion. Festus finally jumps in and goes, you have lost your mind, Paul. I mean, he's like, I can't hear anymore. This is some crazy talk you're talking about. And Paul bravely retorts, and he's like, no, dude, I'm speaking true and rational things. And then you can all see him raising his voice. And besides all this, King Agrippa knows about all these things. Why? None of these events, quote, have escaped his notice, for this was not done in a corner. So Paul's kind of throwing down to Festus, who wouldn't know any better. He's like, no, dude, this king here, supposed king, he knows this is not a big secret. He knows all about this. And, Agrippa's kind of nodding along going, yeah, you're right. I've kind of heard some of this. This is crazy talk. All right. So, all right, next piece of evidence. They listed women as the principal witnesses. Now, Matthew, do you know why that's so weird?
Yeah, because at this time, unfairly, but women were not regarded as having equality with men, and they would say that would be an unreliable witness. If you were making a story up, your story would not lead with our first witness to this thing is a woman.
Exactly.
It wouldn't land.
Exactly. And that's true for both the Jewish culture and the Roman culture. It's really true for all the cultures. If you know your Spartan history, you might say, well, not the Spartans. I think it would have been true for the Spartans too, from a sense of legal cases, like legal positions of authority, trials. You're not going to allow a woman And so for them to come out and say, look, our lead evidence are these women is ridiculous unless they believed it to be true.
Yeah.
Like you would only say it if it was true. If you're making it up, you'd never say it that way. Okay. And then connected to that, the key male figures are all shown as fearful and doubtful. Like they're all shown as afraid. And again, if you were creating a story whole cloth, you typically wouldn't want to show your champions who are going to later sustain this thing called the Christian faith as being like fearful and doubtful. And even back to the women for a second, what we're told is no one believed what Jesus had prophesied. So again, if you read the Gospels, you'll see several places where Jesus is like, dudes, I'm going to get killed, but I'll come back to life in 3 days. It is literally that clear. A couple places it's more veiled, but in some places it is that crystal clear. And again, this is not something added in later in the year 600. Remember what we talked about from the textual support for the documents. All right. So once again, if you were making it up, you would not have them being fearful. Even the women. So Mary Magdalene doesn't go on Sunday morning with Mary and the other ladies that go with her because they are expecting to find Jesus alive. They want to do the Jewish thing necessary to kind of make the body last as long as possible. And there's one part where they're talking amongst themselves, well, who's going to move the stone away? Because there was a giant stone put in front of these tombs so that the stench wouldn't come out, just the way they did it. And they're like, I don't know. And then they get there. So they're not expecting there to be anything there. And lastly, pieces of evidence, first level, the tomb was known by everybody. Again, as Paul's statement, this wasn't done in secret. Everybody knew where this thing was, including the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders. We'll get back to that in a minute. So if someone started running around day 3, he's alive, or in day 40-something, like Peter, giving the big sermon, all anybody had to do, even if they weren't trying to be mean, they're like, oh, really? This is curious. I haven't heard of this. This is amazing. I'm going to walk over to where the tomb is. Oh, look, there's still a stone there. I can smell it. There's a body. Let's open this thing up. Oh, look, there it is. Oh, look, he's got, wounds on his hands. Been very easy to do that.
Yeah.
So they're making this, and it's done in the capital city. So no big secret there. All right, first level. I know, hang with me, everybody. We've still got some time to go. The evidence gets even stronger from what we've already laid out. We've laid out it's pretty good. And I'm now not as skeptical. I still don't have I'm having a hard time believe it as a human, but the evidence is overwhelming. Again, it's like maybe the elephants did climb the Alps. Gosh, really? Wow. Okay. So but the evidence gets even better here. Meaning, first one is we have conversion of open skeptics who become champions. All right. So one we've already mentioned is Paul, so we don't really need to kind of lay into that over and over again, but we've talked about that. But the one that's maybe more interesting for people is Jesus' own brother. Actually, more than one of his brothers, but famously one of his brothers, the brother James, becomes we would say pastor or church leader or bishop. He's like the first major leader of the gathered group. Now you say, wait, what about Peter? Well, all those disciples pretty much left town. There's a moment when there's more persecution. It's longer. It's kind of off our story, but basically they leave town, but there's a group of converts in Jerusalem, obviously, who believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So James becomes the main guy. And you have to realize, and you can see this in some of the writings, James was openly a critic of Jesus when he was alive. At one point, he calls Jesus crazy. Another point, he's basically like brothers do. You have 2 brothers. My sister and I might could do this, but certainly siblings. But I think maybe more truth brothers, where the one brother is like, prove it, do it. I don't believe you. And he's basically challenged, James and his brothers challenged Jesus to go show off about your divinity. And Jesus, there's a whole back and forth with them. So the interesting thing about this is that these guys all ultimately make the claim that they've seen Jesus. James was mentioned in the Creed that you already read to us from Corinth, and then you have the whole story with Paul, right? It is true, someone might argue, that the Corinthian Creed is not a first-person testimony about James, and I definitely understand that. And I've seen some critics of the resurrection try to argue, well, you can't use James here because he doesn't give a first-person explanation. However, there still must be some explanation to explain and provide why James shifts his position. It's hard to come up with another plausible reason. I mean, I guess you could say maybe Mother Mary convinced him, or maybe he felt so sorry for Jesus' little group that he wanted to help them. But then that doesn't explain why he would go ahead and allow himself to be put to death for something he doesn't believe to be true. Like if he's just doing it because mom said to do it, okay, fine. And maybe he liked being in charge, but then they arrest him and now we're going to kill you. It's hard to believe he would just go, yeah, do it, kill me. But in your own brain, you're going, of course, I know Jesus is still dead. Like he wouldn't do that. That doesn't plausibly make sense.
Yeah.
So when you have the creed very early, so again, year 3, saying James is claimed to see him, even though it's not a first person, like with Paul, we have first person. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, the evidence just kind of slowly starts kind of stacking up here. And you've got inductive evidence, you've got deductive evidence. And like you said, that's totally valid.
Yeah.
And like that's a lot of science where you're like, there's no explanation that pulls these things together except this scenario.
Right. Okay, 2 more pieces.
Okay.
Get into the big pieces. The changes to the historic Jewish culture. So Matthew, if I ask you and I said, do you know people or you know of people who are Jewish? I mean, I have some personal friends who are Jewish. And you described what are things Jewish people believe. Like what are some of the things you might throw out?
They meet at the same day every week, and they have certain religious
And that day,
events.
Saturday.
Saturday, yeah, that's
The Sabbath. They would
Sabbath,
use that old phrase.
Yeah. They have different traditions. They do. There's events like bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. There's different traditions and holidays throughout the year.
Hanukkah's the one most non-Jewish people know, but there's several others that if a really devout Jewish person may celebrate at some level that they do. These are all ancient, going way, way back. They have food rules.
Yep.
Not every Jewish person, you may have heard the word kosher.
Right.
Not every Jewish person follows that path, but there's a sense in which if you're a good Jewish person, you would follow that path. There's discussions about that.
Yeah.
There's very specific things. Here's the unique thing about these people, that these are some of the earliest people that we know of. Now, they're not the earliest people that we know of historically, but they're amongst the earliest people that we know of. And since, if you just think of the 1st century AD, so you think all the BC, 3,000 or more years, all these people, most of those people as groups have vanished. You can point to people living in India, but they're just generally saying India. You can point to Egypt for sure. You could point to Persia, modern day Iran, although I'd argue that point that the Mesopotamian Valley people are not Persian. The Egyptian peoples, maybe you could point to, it's fair. But most of the people that you could point to who are alive in the 1st century for sure are no longer a people. They don't exist as an entity. They're not a group of people there. But the Jewish people, along with the Jewish culture, has maintained itself. They have a unique language that still is the same language from, it's, as far as we know, it's far back as you have the written language. Its version of worship, now they don't use the temple sacrifices anymore, but if you know somebody who's Jewish, they actually would like to rebuild the temple. And if they did, they would restart having sacrifices again. They have that unique holy day of Sabbath. They have a belief in monotheism. They're the ones that introduce to the world the concept of a single God only. As long as some of the things that you mentioned, they've been conquered and taken as captives and scattered by Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Macedonians, Romans. And through all that time, you can find these people in far-flung places across the globe. And if you find them, they have these same traditions, the same language, and the same worship. So we could say, just standing back as historians, that they are consistent in their devotion to these things. They haven't given them up as they've been assimilated in other places, as you might find with these other people groups that we could look at in early, antiquity kind of thing. And yet suddenly, out of nowhere, in a rapid, less than a few days period of time, this teacher shows up and a group of faithful Jews incorporate major changes. And they teach other Jews about it based on the resurrection, and they also incorporate major changes. So, for example, they give up their belief about the animal sacrifices. Remember, when Jesus happened, the temple was still alive. So the idea of worshiping their God through sacrificial in a sacrificial system, they abandoned that. They gave up the belief in requirement of keeping the laws of Moses as reported in the Torah, particularly like the food laws and some of the other laws. They maintain the major ideas of the laws because Jesus himself said he wasn't coming to abandon or revoke the laws, but still they looked through the laws and they all of a sudden start picking and choosing to some degree about things that maybe they thought were non-essential. They gave up the Sabbath and shifted worship to Sunday, which was the first work day. Now, I have to stress this for everybody because we're all weekend, Americans. We're all post-Constantine kids. But imagine all of a sudden businesses start taking Mondays off all the time. So Monday was closed all the time, and they required working on Saturday. So the work day went from Tuesday to Saturday, the typical 5-day-a-week kind of a thing. But for centuries, and certainly for at least the past 100 years in the United States, we've honored this thing called the weekend, and the weekend was these two specific days. All of a sudden now, it would mean that Tuesday was the new first day of the week. It's kind of hard for us to imagine our culture abandoning Saturday. College football has to go away, has to shift to another day. NFL's got to shift over to Monday or something. That seems like a radical change. That's precisely what these Jews did. And if you get really picky into it, you can say that they also shifted in their understanding of Messiah. Now, this probably is too nuanced for the level that we need, but just the general idea of the Messiah figure was in a conquering military hero status, like a king on the earth who destroys their enemies. And Jesus depicted, and then he proved through writings, through the Old Testament writings, that really the Messiah was initially going to become the ultimate sacrifice, animal sacrifice system, and then die and then be resurrected. Okay, just make sure we understand this. And I don't know if I'm saying it well enough, because I won't be able to understand that if you thought you needed, well, they did this because they discovered that they had sinned and they needed to be healed. No, they had that already. If you thought, well, they needed this as a way to get closer to God. Nope, they had that already. If they needed a way to be right with God. Nope, they have that already. So it's like you're not looking at a people who realize there's a deficiency in their religion and they need to replace it. The Jewish faith promised a redemptive process to those faithful to God's commands. I like the way, so there's a scholar that I was reading, Jeremiah Johnson, he said this: with all these facts in mind, the reality is, why do you need to invent something new, like a new religion? If Jesus talked about being resurrected, but they killed him and he stayed dead in his tomb, and if the disciples made the whole story up, what would motivate you to make up the resurrection story? If you're Jewish, you don't need to. There's already kind of a resurrection in the future. There is a moment with God in heaven. There's all the things that you think, oh, this is what Christianity offers. That's not what these people were seeing. They were seeing something else. So that's pretty massive when you look at this people group who had not changed under force of death and experiencing death in some cases, and yet here it almost feels flippant, like they just flippantly okay, whatever. But then you go, no, there's no Jewish people who would flippantly give up these beliefs,
right?
Unless the guy who they'd been following, who claimed to be the Son of God, says, I'm going to prove it, and then does, even they don't believe it, and then now they see him alive again, they eat with him, they touch him, their minds are blown, but they're like, oh my gosh, this is the deepest understanding of what Messiah was, and then they follow him on his ways, on his way singular, I should say probably, but not to come up with a new set of rules, but a new understanding of how to get to this idea of union with him. Does that make sense? I don't know if I made that clear or not.
Yeah, it does. It does. You kind of stop seeing these rules and traditions as an end to themselves and then realize, oh, shoot, these were kind of pointing us toward somebody who was to come, and then he shows up and you're like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Those were symbols, not the ends themselves. And now I see the whole picture.
Yeah, this one for me and the women as witnesses are probably the one that tipped the scale the most for me.
And I never hear anybody talking about this part.
Yeah.
I hear people talking about the part that we're going to talk about a little bit. This part is extremely compelling. I mean,
Yeah, I can't. I mean,
irrefutable. I mean,
it's huge.
And the events you're talking about are not debated. I mean,
Right.
these people shifted.
Right. And it's not
You're
one
like,
or two.
You tell me why.
It'd be different if it was one or two.
Yeah.
And then all the converts were non-Jews.
Yeah.
Like eventually, yes, somebody goes, well, wait, what about Paul and the Greeks and the non-Jews? Yes. And so say, again, I said 300. So by 300, I said roughly 30% of the empire were Christians. I would say, off the top of my head, it's probably no more than 20% of that group are Jewish. There's a whole reason why, there's a whole story that goes on. That's not to say Jewish people aren't converting. They still are, and they are to this day. They're seeing all of a sudden this idea that Jesus is the fulfillment of what their scripture, what we call the Christians call the Old Testament, the Jewish scripture, it's the fulfillment of that. And for them to, particularly at that time, to make this massive on a dime shift, I mean, it's just outstanding to me as a historian. I'm like, something's got to explain that. Like, there's no good reason. They didn't do it for any other reason.
Yeah.
After attacks and persecutions, and all of a sudden here they just do it again. I said flippantly, and it did take a little bit of time. There, there's maybe a few years where they're discussing what about the food laws and stuff like that.
But the tide is shifting.
Absolutely,
and there's no gain for it.
Zero gain for them. Zero gain. It's like, I got to have a reason for this, and the only one is the one they offer, no matter how outstanding, or again, and I mean outstanding kind of in like my head blown, like that's a ridiculous option, but it's the only option that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Guess what? That's not the biggest piece of evidence.
What?
The biggest piece of evidence, or I think the biggest piece of evidence, is the fact that you have, for all the original first believers, particularly for, now we're going to get very narrow, the 12, so that's the original 11 plus Matthias, and then if you throw in James and Paul, I think you can make a larger list. But for the original followers, they died for their faith. Now, not all of them were martyred for their faith.
Yeah.
But the idea is, you have these disciples who first reported the resurrection. We know they were openly persecuted in a variety of places, and then some of them were put to death. These are the first missionaries, the first to go proclaiming this crazy, extraordinary, outlandish story. And we have evidence from Dr. Luke, who I've already told you is one of the foremost preeminent historians for the first century Eastern Mediterranean Roman Empire, that they were threatened with death. They were beaten for their persistent belief. We know some were killed. We know actually Saul participated in the killing of one of the first, if not the first person. Now, to be clear, we are not saying that these disciples, or somehow Christians, are the only ones to die for their beliefs or their faith. The idea of there being a martyr, or someone being a martyr for their belief, that yes, happens in a lot of places, not even for religious beliefs, but it especially happens amongst religions. What we're saying is that these first disciples were actually in position to know the truth of the event, whether they did or did not see Jesus alive. So like you and I, we've said before, we're both Christians. So you could say we're people who believe, and we believe because other people have told us. And at various levels, the two of us have done our own examinations, had our own life experiences that have given us confidence in the thing we've been told. But let's say it was a hoax. If you and I chose to die for our belief, then people would just sort of feel sorry for us. They'd be like, oh, like kind of what Paul wrote. It's like, oh, it's too bad Matthew believed this crazy lie kind of thing. But they wouldn't think they might think we were stupid, but it wouldn't be like we knowingly lied. It was that we had died for something that we believed in. And so we're not saying these other people who have been martyred for other religions or other ideas are not there. They are, or that they're not as good or not as quality or not as big of a story. The point is not about that these first disciples were martyred, but that they were the ones who clearly would have known they were lying at the time the guy's putting, to use our metaphor, a gun to their head.
Yeah. You recant.
Most everybody does.
Who put yourself in that position. If it's a lie, if you know it's a lie, and you would, like you said, you would know. For them, it's not a story they heard and chose to believe. They were there.
Yeah.
If it's true, they know it's true. If it's a lie, they know full well it's a lie. So when it comes down to a gruesome death, if it's a lie, do you not go, whoa, 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 I got it. Listen, I recant. I will spread the word that this whole thing was a lie and a sham. I'm better off to you that way than my death.
Yep.
Let's not do this.
Well, now, if somebody's interested in, because we're not going to have time to go into it here, if you're interested in the historical evidence about this, I think I've mentioned Josh McDowell. He's a eminent, very famous, probably the world's most famous apologist, was an atheist himself. It's arguable that he's actually spoken to more humans about Jesus than anybody in all of human history.
Wow.
I mean, it's crazy. He's still alive. He's in his 90s.
Yeah.
He has a son named Sean, who's also a professor at Biola. And he, in his doctoral work about 15 years ago, studied this. This past year, he released an updated version. I'm just going to tell you the name of the book. I'll link it in the show notes. It's called The Fate of the Apostles. You want the second edition. It's the 10-year anniversary edition. And he walks through and kind of does all the research and shows you, like, are we sure these people died for their faith? And there's a really lovely book to kind of go through. Maybe I'll do a bonus episode where I'll come back and kind of walk through these names kind of one by one and give you more of Sean's. Maybe I'll reach out to Sean, see if he wants to come on. That'd be cool. I don't know if he'd pull that off or not. He's big time. We're not big time. But anyway, the evidence behind this is, again, it's rock solid in that you've got this group. Now, 3 of them die natural deaths.
Okay.
And Sean's convinced of this. And again, I'm following him in the evidence. But what's interesting is for all of these, so there's 14 names, for all of these, there is some evidence at different points that they were martyred. Now, in the Middle Ages, there became a real fascination with martyrs and people who died for their faith. And so some of those authors, they used, we might say, weak sources. And so you can actually find some documents from like the 9th, 10th, 11th century that suggest even these guys. But John, Matthew, Philip, Sean's very convinced. The evidence is very solid that they died natural deaths. But that's not the point. With all of the people, there's no historical evidence that they ever recanted or turned back. We know each one of them experienced some kinds of persecutions, whether that was beatings, put in isolation, separation, and they were all willing to die for their death. I mean, for this story. Now, well, why? Why did they do this? Some people have said, well, maybe they were killed against their will, and there's zero evidence for that. There's no evidence that they somehow were killed against their will, that they recounted their faith. And then, again, as we were just saying, well, maybe they were lied to. But the story behind the appearances is that none of these heard it secondhand. So remember I told you Peter preached and early on, and we're told several thousands of people believed. They all heard it secondhand. If they were persecuted, that'd be like you and me being persecuted.
Right.
And so it'd be like, I don't know if that's not weighty evidence. That doesn't convince me. So we're not talking about those guys. We're talking about these guys. And it's not one or two. It's a whole group. And so that's a big piece of the puzzle. Right. So is that all that makes sense? If I laid out the case, you think it's good as possible?
Yes. I mean, I feel like it's airtight.
Okay. Well,
certainly you couldn't have anything further.
Well, actually, what I want to do is there are people who don't think it's airtight. So I'm sure you've heard some of these arguments themselves, like, well, why could we explain this away? In other words, nobody really wants to argue about how Julius Caesar was killed because it's kind of like, well, doesn't really matter. Big deal.
Yeah.
Which that's a whole telling thing in and of itself that it still matters about Jesus. But I'll just say, I concede to you, the listener, that people will go, well, if Jesus came back to life, that means something. And I may not like what it means. And I don't want to have to confront this. So I don't want this to be true. I got it. We're going to talk more about that probably in the next episode. But I want you to understand that I'm with you in being skeptical, as I've tried to be honest about saying.
Right.
And so then now we're coming to this point where the evidence is overwhelming. But is it possible? Is there any other shred of an answer that we can come up with? So let's walk through some of these.
Yeah. Well, One idea, getting again back specifically to the crucifixion and resurrection, there's an idea that Jesus swooned on the cross. He was never actually factually dead.
Yeah, the Princess Bride. He's mostly dead.
Mostly dead.
Right. Well, again, this is discounted by all the expert, but let's have a mind exercise. Let's pretend that that's true.
Okay.
Right. It's hard to build a case for him having enough personal strength to open the tomb door. Right. So how does he get out?
Right.
Because remember, he was beaten to within an inch of his life. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
Right. And you hung on a cross for some length of time before they magically thought, oh, he's dead, Ned. Remember, we didn't get into this. They actually stab him. So I know you can survive a stab wound. Okay, so maybe he survived that also. So now you got a half beaten, hung on a cross for several hours, and then stabbed. And somehow you're suggesting he gets up by himself and opens the tomb door. But even if he did, how could him limping and struggling out of the cross invoke any enthusiasm by the followers? They might want to nurse him back to life and get him on a boat and get him out of there before he gets killed a second time. But there's no like Messiah feelings at that point with that guy.
Yeah, that don't hold up. You're
That's
like,
the silliest one, by the way.
yeah, it's sure. Let's chase this down the line. Okay, there we followed it to its logical conclusion. Somehow, a man who's been beaten within an inch of his life, who didn't die, pushed a massive rock and I guess slipped by a squad of centurions. Oh, sure, okay. If this were a movie, something crazy.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Another idea is the appearance, Jesus' appearance. They're all legendary.
So we've already addressed that. Historically, it's impossible. We got evidence within, say, 5 years. So that one's impossible.
Yeah. Well, maybe the appearances are all hallucinations.
Psychologically, it's impossible for groups.
Yep.
It'd be plausible. Like I told you, I would accept that as a real plausible answer. Seriously, if it was just Paul's testimony, because Paul's does sound
kind
like
of
it
fantastical.
could be. Yeah, it does. Right. You have multiple groups.
500 at once. Yeah.
And again, as we said when we talked about the witnesses, most of the time it was at the same time. So it wasn't just a group of people, meaning 30 individual moments, because again, you could say those are hallucinations. Although if you had 30 individual moments, now your anecdotal evidence is starting to stack up. But we're talking about 1 to 15, 1 to 20, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, meaning Jesus is the one. So now you've got groups looking at each other. You just know after he left, because in some cases he came, talked, and left. You can just imagine, we wouldn't have any evidence of this. I wish we did, where they're going, what just happened? And some of them, I'm sure, would be like, that didn't happen. That we're crazy. And then you're looking across at your friend going, did you see that?
You saw
they're
it
going,
too.
I saw it. And now you're looking at each other going, wait, did we all see that? Is this possible? Because he's not there. He left. And in some cases, we're told he comes in and out of the door. So it's, again, it looks like we would say sleight of hand or some kind of magical effects from movies. But then there's other times when, again, he's eating with them, sitting, opens the door, that kind of stuff. So again, hallucination, not really possible.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it was an example of groupthink.
So maybe they had a vision and then they convinced others. But that, again, doesn't hold up. And you get deeper and deeper into it with the empty tomb itself. So you got an empty tomb, and that doesn't answer for James or Paul. So if you did say the original disciples all were part of groupthink, they just convinced themselves of it. That does not settle the issue for how James found out or how Paul found out, and you got an empty tomb.
Yeah. Well, perhaps the disciples stole or hid Jesus' body.
Okay. You mentioned a second ago something that is disputed by some, but one of our biographical stories, it's in the book of, it's Matthew's account, is that Roman soldiers were put on guard because the Jewish officials had themselves heard a rumor they were afraid about Jesus coming back to life, or that people would pretend that it came back to life. And so they're like, you know what, we don't need to deal with this. We've squashed this. Now, again, remind yourself, with Matthew written at least by 60, 70 at the latest AD. So we're only 40 years out. So a lot of people would have been alive to have discredited him when he wrote this, right? So there's no discrediting at this. And so what we're told is that Roman guards went, there was a seal put on the door. And so then later we're told that they basically went back to the officials and like, we have a problem. the body's gone. Now, they didn't say it came back to life. They just said the body's gone. And so Matthew gives us his accounting. You can read it in chapter 28 if you want to go to your Bible and read it. And we're told there that a decision is made that if they were asked, the soldiers are to say, quote, Jesus' disciples came during the night while we were sleeping and they stole the body. And then later, Matthew tells us, the guard's story spread widely amongst the Jews and is told to this day, meaning to 65, 70 AD. So Matthew knows this story. It's why he's included it in there. This is one of the very first what-if stories that's raised by critics and skeptics. And if you read some of the very first apologists, some of the very first people, we mentioned some of these names like Justin Martyr or Tertullian, some of their writings address this potential hypothesis that, oh, you guys stole the body. Now, let's just, again, thought exercise. Let's imagine there was no guard, because, again, some critics are like, it's only in Matthew. I don't believe there was a guard. And let's imagine the disciples intervened. So now we're back to these same guys then died for a lie. They took a body, they hid it, they knew they hid it, and then later if you want to build a following and kind of pull off a cool thing, great, until the time the authorities come and want to kill you. At that point, you're like, what? It's hard to accept for that. And again, that has no answer for James and Paul. And for the 500, you have this group saying they saw Jesus alive. So that doesn't square. Now you'd have a major contradiction there.
Yeah. Another kind of related to that one, well, maybe somebody else, perhaps family members, relocated the body, stole the body, and the women who we talked about earlier as the early witnesses, they just got confused and they went to the wrong tomb, and he's not there because it was never there in the first place.
Yeah, again, all these begin to just, hopefully you can see, listener, these just completely fall apart. They don't account for James, Paul. They don't change for the disciples. This one comes from in the Gospel of Mark. Mark notes that there was a young man dressed in a white robe. And so we typically take that to mean it was an angel, but critics would say that was really just a garden caretaker. And so then Mary's in the wrong tomb, in the wrong place. She just gets confused by the whole story. Again, if you read the rest of Mark at that point, that doesn't hold up. It's not what he writes. And you're still back to people died for a lie. Remember, there's also the idea that this Peter preaching and others, this is happening in the capital city. So this idea of him saying, hey, you know this happened among you. Certainly Jewish leaders would have gone overboard to track down the body if it was reburied somewhere else. Okay, a couple more of these.
All right. Only Jesus appearing to everybody was only a spiritual resurrection. So the disciples did see something, but it's not an actual physical body.
And again, multiple historical evidence with physical interaction. We're told of one of the disciples touching his side where he was stabbed, his hands. We're told of the disciples at a couple of different points eating breakfast. He walked side by side with two of the disciples to the city of Emmaus. What's interesting is in Greek, when you go back to the creeds, there's a word that you could use in Greek to express the idea of an immaterial body. And actually, Paul uses it in that Corinthian letter. So he, at that point, it's chapter 9. He's talking about something different. He's talking about, you use the idea of body, but he really means not physical, right? So there's a word to use there, and that's not the word he uses, obviously. He's talking about a physical body when he's making that claim in the creed you read. He's talking about a physical, real body.
Another one is, I like this one. Well, it simply could not have happened because supernatural events do not happen.
And I mean, this is obviously this is actually a more modern take on this, probably over the past, say, 75 years, maybe 150 years. It's just the refusal. In other words, they start with me as a skeptic, and you go, humans don't come back to life. And then they just go, and that's the end of it.
Right. I'm not going to delve into your mountain of evidence. It just doesn't happen. Good day, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which, I guess my short answer most of the time is like, then you basically are saying you won't believe anything from antiquity. In fact, you won't believe anything at all unless you physically are there. And then you'd almost have to question if you can believe any of those things that you physically were present for.
Yes.
Because it could all be made up in your mind. You could have convinced yourself. And if any of it's ever like outstanding or beyond, it kind of leaves you hanging in this story. As for the disciples, remember, they never believed Jesus was the Messiah come back for life, right? They didn't believe it till they saw something. The strength of the historical evidence is too overwhelming. And for the person who just refuses to go down the supernatural road, well, in one sense, you've kind of pulled yourself into a cul-de-sac where nothing in history ever happened. Let me wrap it up here. I know we've gone long. Thanks for staying with us, listeners. At the start of the episode, I talked about my reasons for doubt. And I said, I've already repeated it, humans don't come back to life 3 days after being killed. So now I'm confronted with this solid evidence, whether I like it or not. But I want to bring up a point, and this kind of connects to the last objection, right? If the story was only about a person who was human and never said anything else, maybe we got something to work with there. But this being, this man named Jesus, in multiple places claims to be God. Both the idea that the Jewish people understand of their God, but just this notion of the maker, the one true God. Now, while that claim has complications that we could look at, we have to go into and do a whole bunch of conversation about what was said when, I can at least see that if his claim has merit that he's God, then I need to look for non-human activity or superhuman activity, above nature activity. Because if he is God, then the activities or actions would be things that couldn't happen only for a human. Like I said, a human cannot come back to life. But a being that is, and I understand this is fantastical, both a human and God, well, that's actually something I would expect this person to do, to be able to do, to make the claim. In fact, I would have less belief I am this special being who is both a human and God, not a being pointing to God. This is one of the unique things about Christianity. The founder of Christianity does not say, let me point you to God. He says, I am God. He's the only one that says that. It's crazy talk. And if he's going to make that claim, then Carl at least says, okay, prove it. Right. Back it up. Right? And you can't back it up by doing, like even, he fasted for 40 days. Other humans can fast for 40 days. Right. I fasted for 15 days. I know it can be done. Right? So it's like, that doesn't prove anything, but could he do things that don't stand up for a human to be done? Well, if he did come back to life, the Christian faith, which again, the source of the moral virtue foundation of the U.S. founders, stands on the resurrection. And the resurrection stands upon the evidence that it did happen. And that evidence is contained in this thing we've called this library of 66 sources. It seems massively unassailable, which means then for Carl the skeptic, I have to go back and say, well, if he did come back to life, And that's where we're going to end it, right there.
Love it.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkriesman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kriesman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkriesman.com/uncovered.